You didn't lose me. You traded me for a rat, and now you have nothing.
Daniel Ross stared at the DNA test results in his trembling hands. The words 0% probability of paternity burning into his retinas like acid. His 3-month-old daughter slept peacefully in her crib just 10 feet away, completely unaware that her entire existence had just shattered her father's world into a million razor-sharp pieces. 6 months earlier, he'd gotten a vasectomy because his wife Melissa had convinced him it was the responsible thing to do. "We can barely afford this apartment, Danny," she'd said, her green eyes wide with manufactured concern. "We need to focus on our careers first. Maybe kids in 5 years when we're more stable." He'd trusted her completely, loved her completely. And now, holding this piece of paper that proved beyond any doubt that she'd been lying to him for over a year, Daniel felt something cold and calculating settle into his chest, where his heart used to be. The breakfast scene played in his mind like a broken record. Melissa had been buttering toast, her auburn hair catching the morning sunlight streaming through their kitchen window. She'd mentioned the vasectomy so casually as if discussing the weather. "Dr. Peterson says it's a simple procedure," she'd said, not looking up from her plate. 20 minutes, and we never have to worry about accidents again." Daniel had hesitated, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Are you sure? I mean, what if we change our minds?" "We won't," she'd said firmly, finally meeting his eyes. "Trust me on this, Danny. It's what's best for us." He'd noticed her phone buzz on the table, watched her glance at it and smile slightly before flipping it face down. At the time, he'd thought nothing of it. Now, that small smile felt like a knife between his shoulder blades. The procedure had gone smoothly. Dr. Peterson was thorough, professional, and had assured Daniel that the success rate was over 99%. "You'll want to wait about 3 months before you're completely sterile," he'd explained. "Use protection until then, just to be safe." Daniel had followed those instructions to the letter. He'd been careful, responsible, exactly the kind of man who deserved a faithful wife. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Melissa had been the perfect nurse during his recovery, bringing him ice packs and pain medication, making his favorite soup, even taking time off work to make sure he was comfortable. Her concern had seemed so genuine that Daniel had fallen in love with her all over again. "I'm so proud of you for doing this," she'd whispered one night as they lay in bed, his stitches still tender. "It shows how much you love me." "I'd do anything for you," he'd replied, meaning every word. She'd kissed his forehead then, her lips soft and warm. "I know you would." Now, 6 months later, those words tasted like poison in his mouth. The announcement had come on a Tuesday evening in October. Daniel had been reviewing logistics reports at the kitchen table when Melissa burst through the front door, her face flushed with excitement. "Danny," she'd called out, her voice higher than usual. "You're not going to believe this." She'd rushed to the bathroom, and Daniel had heard her rummaging through cabinets. When she emerged, she was holding a pregnancy test, her hands shaking dramatically. "Look," she'd said, thrusting the test toward him. 2 pink lines blazed across the small window. Daniel had felt the world tilt sideways. That's impossible." The doctor said. "I know," Melissa had laughed, but there was something forced about it. "I guess we're that 1%. The procedure must have failed." She'd thrown her arms around his neck, and Daniel had held her, his mind racing. The timing felt wrong somehow, but he'd pushed those thoughts aside. Medical procedures could fail. It happened. "Are you happy?" Melissa had asked, pulling back to search his face. Daniel had managed a smile. Of course. Surprised, but happy. But even as he'd said the words, a tiny seed of doubt had planted itself in his mind. Something about Melissa's reaction felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing this moment. That night, his phone had buzzed with a text from his sister Claire. "Call me. Now." Claire Bennett worked as a paralegal at a family law firm downtown, and she had a reputation for seeing through people's lies. When Daniel had called her back, her voice had been grim. "Danny, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay," he'd said, stepping out onto their apartment balcony so Melissa couldn't overhear. "How sure are you that this baby is yours?" The question had hit him like a physical blow. "Claire, what kind of question is that? Of course it's mine. You had a vasectomy 6 months ago. Procedures can fail." They can, Claire had agreed. But they usually don't. And your wife's reaction tonight seemed off? You weren't even here. I could hear it in your voice when you called. You don't sound like a man who just got good news. You sound like a man who's trying to convince himself of something. Daniel had been quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights twinkle below. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you get a DNA test. Quietly. The words had hung in the air between them like a loaded tool. I can't do that to Melissa. If she found out, if she's innocent, she'll never know. And if she's not... Claire had let the sentence hang unfinished. Daniel had ended the call without agreeing to anything, but Claire's words had burrowed into his brain like parasites. Over the next several weeks, he'd found himself watching Melissa more carefully, looking for signs of deception. She'd thrown herself into pregnancy preparations with enthusiasm that seemed genuine. She'd bought baby books, started a Pinterest board for nursery ideas, and even suggested they start looking for a bigger apartment. We'll need more space, she'd said one evening as they browsed rental listings online. And maybe somewhere with better schools. Daniel had nodded along, but something about her eagerness felt forced. It was as if she was trying too hard to sell him on their happy future together. The baby had been born on a cold February morning after 18 hours of labor. Daniel had been there the entire time, holding Melissa's hand, whispering encouragement, playing the role of devoted husband and father. When the doctor had placed their daughter in his arms, Daniel had felt a rush of love so pure and overwhelming that it had brought tears to his eyes. She was perfect. Tiny fingers, button nose, a shock of dark hair that looked nothing like either of his parents. She's beautiful, he'd whispered, and meant it completely. Melissa had been exhausted but radiant, her face glowing with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from a job well done. Look what we made, Danny. But even in that perfect moment, doubt had nagged at him. The baby's features were distinctive in a way that didn't quite fit either of their faces. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber that Daniel had never seen in his family tree. 2 weeks later, while Melissa slept and the baby napped, Daniel had carefully collected a sample for DNA testing. His hands had shaken as he sealed the envelope, and he'd almost thrown it away 3 times before finally mailing it. The wait had been excruciating. 15 business days. That felt like 15 years. Daniel had thrown himself into work, managing logistics for a mid-sized shipping company, trying not to think about what the results might reveal. When the envelope had finally arrived, Daniel had been sitting in his work truck during his lunch break. He'd stared at it for a full 5 minutes before finding the courage to open it. 0% probability of paternity. The words had hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. All the air had rushed out of his lungs, and for a moment he'd thought he might pass out. But instead of collapsing, something else had happened. The crushing weight of betrayal had transformed into something colder, sharper, more focused. Daniel had felt his grief crystallize into purpose. He'd called Claire immediately. I need to know everything about Eric Lawson, he'd said without preamble. Claire had been quiet for a moment. Eric from Melissa's work? That's the one. Danny, what did you find? Just get me everything you can. Work history, financial records, anything that might be useful. I'll make some calls, Claire had said. But Danny, be careful. Whatever you're planning. I'm not planning anything yet, Daniel had lied. I just need information. But even as he'd said it, Daniel had known he was going to destroy them both. Eric Lawson worked in the same logistics company as Melissa, one division over in freight coordination. Daniel had seen him at company Christmas parties and summer barbecues. Tall, cocky, with the kind of easy smile that attracted women and made other men want to punch him. He'd always been friendly to Daniel, slapping him on the back and asking about work, making jokes about married life. You're a lucky man, Ross, he'd said more than once. Melissa's a catch. Now those interactions took on a sinister new meaning. Every handshake, every smile, every casual conversation had been a lie, built on top of a lie. Daniel had started following them after work, using his knowledge of delivery routes and traffic patterns to stay invisible. It hadn't taken long to confirm what he already knew in his gut. The 3rd time he'd tailed them, they'd gone to the Riverside Inn, a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. Daniel had watched from his car as they disappeared into room 237, Eric's hand on the small of Melissa's back in a gesture that was intimate and familiar. Daniel had taken photos with his phone, time-stamped, GPS-tagged, crystal clear. He'd sent them to Claire immediately, along with a text, "Start building the case." Claire had called him within an hour. "Jesus, Danny, how long has this been going on?" "I don't know yet." "But I'm going to find out." "What do you need from me?" "Everything. I want phone records, email accounts, financial statements. I want to know every time they've been together, every lie they've told, every cent they've spent. That's going to take time. I've got nothing but time." Claire had delivered a week later, and the evidence had been overwhelming. Months of explicit text messages, hotel receipts charged to Eric's credit card, even photos they'd taken of themselves that were too graphic to look at without feeling physically ill. But the smoking tool had been a text exchange from just 2 days before Melissa had announced her pregnancy. "Eric, are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" "Melissa, he's too trusting and too stupid." The vasectomy was perfect timing. "Eric, what if he wants a DNA test?" "Melissa, he won't. He loves me too much to doubt me." "Eric, and if he does?" "Melissa, then we'll deal with it, but he won't." "I know my husband." Daniel had read those messages sitting in his car outside their apartment building, watching Melissa's silhouette move around their living room as she prepared dinner. She'd been humming, he'd noticed. Actually humming while she cooked, completely at peace with her deception. The rage that had filled him in that moment had been unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It had been pure and clean and focused, like a laser beam cutting through steel. But Daniel had forced himself to wait. Rage was useful, but revenge required planning. Claire had connected him with her boss, Patricia Montgomery, a family law attorney with a reputation for being ruthless in divorce cases. Patricia had reviewed the evidence with the kind of cold professionalism that Daniel had found comforting. "This is solid," she'd said, spreading photos and documents across her mahogany desk. "Paternity fraud, adultery, possibly fraud if she's claimed any benefits based on the marriage. We can destroy them both. What's the best approach?" Patricia had smiled, and it hadn't been a pleasant expression. "Simultaneous attack on multiple fronts: financial, professional, legal, and social. By the time we're done, they'll wish they'd never been born." Daniel had also learned that Eric was up for a major promotion, senior logistics coordinator, with a 30% salary increase and stock options. The promotion required HR approval and a clean disciplinary record. That information had given Daniel an idea. The confrontation had taken place in a construction trailer at one of Daniel's work sites, after hours when they wouldn't be interrupted. Daniel had called Eric and asked him to meet, claiming he wanted to discuss something important about Melissa. Eric had shown up 20 minutes late, his usual cocky swagger on full display. Sorry, man," he'd said, sliding into a folding chair across from Daniel's desk. "Traffic was brutal." "What's this about Melissa? She's not giving you trouble at home, is she?" Daniel had almost laughed at the audacity of it. Instead, he'd reached into a manila folder and pulled out the DNA test results. "Actually, Eric, I wanted to talk to you about your daughter." Eric's face had gone white. "My what?" Daniel had placed the test results on the desk between them, followed by printed copies of the text messages, hotel receipts, and photos. "Congratulations," Daniel had said, his voice perfectly calm. "Oh, you're a father." Eric had stared at the evidence like it was a venomous snake. His hands had shaken as he'd picked up the DNA report, his eyes scanning the results again and again. This doesn't prove anything," he'd finally stammered. "DNA tests can be wrong? Can they?" Daniel had asked. Because according to this lab, there's a 99.97% chance you're the biological father of the child my wife gave birth to 3 months ago." Eric had tried to stand up, but his legs had given out, and he'd collapsed back into his chair. "Look, Danny, I don't know what you think you know, but—" "I know you've been sleeping with my wife for over a year," Daniel had interrupted. "I know you got her pregnant. I know she convinced me to get a vasectomy so she could pass your child off as mine. And I know you've been laughing about it behind my back." He'd pulled out one of the printed text messages and read it aloud. "He's too trusting. And too stupid. That's what she said about me, Eric, and you agreed." Eric's face had flushed red, then gone pale again. "Danny, listen. I never meant for any of this to happen. It just sort of happened, you know?" These things happen. No, Daniel had said quietly. These things don't just happen. People make choices. You chose to sleep with my wife. She chose to lie to me about the vasectomy. You both chose to let me believe that child was mine. What do you want? Eric had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel had leaned forward slightly. I want you to understand that your life as you know it is over. I'm filing a paternity suit against you tomorrow. You're going to pay child support retroactive to the birth, plus medical expenses, plus legal fees. I don't have that kind of money. Then you better find it. Because if you don't, wage garnishment is a beautiful thing. Eric had tried one more time to bargain. Look, can't we work something out? Maybe we can keep this quiet between us? Daniel had smiled then, and it had been every bit as cold as Patricia Montgomery's. Oh, Eric, this is just the beginning. Daniel had filed the HR complaint the next morning. Patricia had helped him craft it carefully, documenting the affair, the use of company property for personal meetings, and the violation of workplace conduct policies. The complaint had been accompanied by a thick folder of evidence, emails sent on company time, photos taken in Eric's office after hours, and testimony from other employees who had witnessed inappropriate behavior. Within 48 hours, Eric had been called into HR for questioning. By the end of the week, his promotion had been withdrawn pending investigation, but Daniel hadn't stopped there. Claire had accidentally leaked the story to a local business reporter who specialized in workplace scandals. The article had run on the front page of the business section. Local logistics manager under investigation for workplace affair. The story had been picked up by the company's competitors and spread through the industry like wildfire. Eric's professional reputation had been destroyed overnight. Meanwhile, Daniel had been playing the part of the devastated husband perfectly. When coworkers asked about the baby, he'd smiled sadly and said he was working through some personal issues. When pressed for details, he'd simply said that sometimes people aren't who you think they are. The sympathy had been overwhelming. His boss had given him extra time off. His coworkers had brought him casseroles and offered to help with anything he needed. Even the company president had pulled him aside to express his concern and support. Through it all, Daniel had maintained his composure. He'd been polite, gracious, and heartbroken. The perfect victim. Melissa had been unraveling more slowly, but the cracks were definitely showing. The HR investigation at her company had made her paranoid and defensive. She'd started having whispered phone conversations that ended abruptly when Daniel entered the room. Everything okay at work? He'd asked one evening, after she'd hung up quickly on what had obviously been Eric. Fine, she'd said, not meeting his eyes. Just some office drama? Want to talk about it? No, it's nothing important. But Daniel had seen the way her hands trembled as she'd poured herself a glass of wine. He'd seen the dark circles under her eyes, the way she'd started double-checking locks and looking over her shoulder. The final confrontation had come at Melissa's parents' house during what was supposed to be a celebration brunch for the baby. Her mother, Linda, had gone all out. Fresh flowers, mimosas, a spread of food that could have fed 20 people. We're so proud of you both, Linda had gushed as they'd settled around the dining room table. 3 months old and she's already so alert. She's going to be brilliant, just like her daddy. Daniel had smiled and nodded, bouncing the baby gently on his knee. She really was beautiful, and he'd found himself genuinely caring for her, despite everything. None of this was her fault. Melissa's father, Robert, had raised his mimosa glass. Now to Daniel and Melissa, and to our beautiful granddaughter. Everyone had raised their glasses, smiling and laughing. It had been the perfect family moment. That's when Daniel had reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the DNA test results. He'd placed the document on the table next to Melissa's plate, right between the scrambled eggs and fresh fruit. The conversation had died instantly. Robert had been the first to speak. What's this, son? DNA test results, Daniel had said calmly, taking a sip of his mimosa. Turns out, your granddaughter isn't actually my daughter. The silence that followed had been deafening. Linda had gone white as a sheet. Robert had picked up the paper with shaking hands, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. This says... Robert had started, then stopped, his face growing red. 0% probability of paternity, Daniel had finished helpfully. Which is interesting, since Melissa told me the baby was conceived after a failed vasectomy. All eyes had turned to Melissa, who had been sitting frozen in her chair like a deer in headlights. Melissa? Linda had whispered. What is this? I I can explain, Melissa had stammered. Please do, Daniel had said. I'm curious to hear this explanation myself. The test must be wrong. These things happen all the time. Robert had looked at her with disgust. Don't lie to us, Melissa. Not now. I'm not lying. Then explain these, Daniel had said, pulling out printed copies of the text messages. He'd selected the most damning ones, the ones that left no room for interpretation. He'd read them aloud in the same calm voice he'd used to discuss the weather. He's too trusting and too stupid. The vasectomy was perfect timing. Linda had started crying. Robert had looked like he was about to have a stroke. Who is he, Melissa? Robert had demanded. Who's the father? Eric Lawson, Daniel had answered before Melissa could speak, her co-worker. They'd been having an affair for over a year. The explosion that followed had been everything Daniel had hoped for. Robert had started shouting. Linda had been sobbing, and Melissa's younger brother David had looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. How could you do this? Linda had wailed. How could you do this to Daniel? To us? You don't understand, Melissa had said, tears streaming down her face. It's complicated. No, Daniel had said, standing up with the baby still in his arms. It's actually very simple. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too. You wanted Eric's baby and my financial security. You thought I was too stupid to figure it out. He'd kissed Linda on the cheek gently. Thank you for brunch, Linda. It was lovely. Then he'd walked out, leaving Melissa to face her family's rage alone. The aftermath had been swift and brutal. Within a month, Eric had been terminated from his job for policy violations. His unemployment claim had been denied due to misconduct, and the wrongful termination lawsuit his lawyer had filed had been dismissed when Patricia had presented evidence of his affair. The paternity suit had gone through without a hitch. Eric had tried to argue that he hadn't known the child was his, but the text messages had proved otherwise. The judge had been particularly unimpressed with Eric's attempt to claim ignorance. Mr. Lawson, Judge Harris had said during the hearing, these text messages clearly show that you were aware of the pregnancy and actively participated in deceiving the plaintiff. You will pay child support retroactive to the birth of the child, plus medical expenses, plus the plaintiff's legal fees. The monthly payment had been calculated based on Eric's previous salary, which meant he'd be paying based on the promotion he'd lost. It was a beautiful irony that Daniel had appreciated deeply. But the financial hit hadn't been Eric's only problem. The scandal had followed him to every job interview. His LinkedIn profile had been inundated with comments and messages from people who'd read about the case. His reputation in the logistics industry had been completely destroyed. Within 6 weeks of the judgment, Eric had been forced to move back in with his parents and take a job at a warehouse, making a third of his previous salary. Melissa's situation had been even worse. The divorce had been finalized quickly, with Patricia arguing successfully for fault-based grounds due to adultery. Daniel had kept the apartment, the car, and most of their shared assets. Melissa had been left with legal fees she couldn't afford, and a reputation that preceded her everywhere she went. Her family had cut her off completely. Robert had told her she was no longer welcome in their home until she figured out how to be a decent human being. Linda had refused to take her phone calls. Her friends had abandoned her one by one as the story spread through their social circle. The few who'd initially tried to remain neutral had eventually chosen sides, and they hadn't chosen hers. The final humiliation had come when Melissa had been forced to move in with Eric in his parents' basement. The two people who'd thought they were so clever, so much smarter than Daniel, had ended up broke, unemployed, and living like teenagers in a suburban ranch house. Daniel had run into them once at a grocery store, about 3 months after the divorce was finalized. They'd been in the discount section, shopping with coupons, looking miserable and defeated. Eric had tried to avoid eye contact, but Melissa had stared at Daniel with pure hatred. She'd looked like she wanted to say something, but Daniel had simply nodded politely and continued his shopping. The last confrontation had happened at a bar downtown where Daniel had been having drinks with some coworkers. Melissa's former best friend, Jennifer, had approached him at the bar. You know, what you did to her was cruel, Jennifer had said, her voice slurred with alcohol. What I did to her? Daniel had asked, genuinely curious. destroying her life like that. Over one mistake. Daniel had set down his beer and turned to face her fully. One mistake? Jennifer, she had an affair for over a year. She tricked me into getting a vasectomy so she could pass another man's child off as mine. She planned to let me raise and pay for a child that wasn't mine, while she continued sleeping with her boyfriend. That's not one mistake. That's a year-long campaign of deception. But you humiliated her in front of her family. That was cruel. I told the truth. If the truth was humiliating, that's on her, not me. Jennifer had started to argue, but Daniel had held up his hand. Let me ask you something, Jennifer. If your husband had done the same thing to you, would you have just quietly accepted it? Would you have said, oh well, mistakes happen, and moved on? Jennifer had opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. That's what I thought, Daniel had said, turning back to his drink. Jennifer had stormed off, but Daniel had noticed that she'd never tried to defend Melissa to him again. The truth was, Daniel felt no guilt about what he'd done. Every consequence Melissa and Eric had faced had been a direct result of their own choices. He'd simply made sure those choices had appropriate consequences. 6 months after the divorce, Daniel had started dating again. He'd met Sarah, a kindergarten teacher with kind eyes and an infectious laugh, at a coffee shop near his office. She'd known about his situation from the beginning. The story had been impossible to keep quiet in their small city, but she'd been impressed by how he'd handled it. You could have gotten angry and done something stupid, she'd said during one of their early dates. Instead, you were smart about it. You made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else the same way. Daniel had appreciated that perspective. He hadn't been seeking revenge for its own sake. He'd been seeking justice. Now, a year later, Daniel was sitting in that same rooftop bar where he'd celebrated with Claire after everything was finalized. Sarah was beside him, her hand in his, both of them looking out over the city lights. Do you ever regret it? Sarah had asked. How you handled everything? Daniel had considered the question seriously. No, he'd said finally. They made their choices. I just made sure there were consequences. His phone had buzzed with a text from Claire. Saw Eric at the unemployment office today, still looking rough. Daniel had shown the message to Sarah, who'd shaken her head. Do you feel sorry for them at all? She'd asked. For the baby, yes. She didn't ask for any of this, but for them, Daniel had shrugged. They're adults. They knew what they were doing. Sarah had squeezed his hand. You're a good man, Daniel Ross. I'm a man who doesn't like being made a fool of, he'd corrected. There's a difference. As they'd prepared to leave the bar, Daniel had gotten one final text of the evening. It was from an unknown number, but he'd recognized the writing style immediately. I hope you're happy. You destroyed everything. Daniel had shown the message to Sarah, who'd rolled her eyes. Even now, she thinks she's the victim, Sarah had said. Daniel had typed back a simple response. I didn't destroy anything. I just revealed what was already there. He'd blocked the number immediately after sending it. Walking to their car, Sarah had asked, Do you think they'll ever learn from this? Eric might, Daniel had said after thinking about it. He's weak, but not fundamentally evil. He got caught up in something that spiraled out of control. And Melissa? Melissa still thinks the only thing she did wrong was get caught. People like that don't change. Daniel had been right. 2 years later, Claire had told him that Melissa had been caught cheating on Eric with a married man from her new job. The pattern was repeating itself exactly as Daniel had predicted. Some people never learn, Claire had said. No, Daniel had agreed, they don't. But Daniel had learned. He'd learned that trust was precious and fragile. He'd learned that some people were capable of breathtaking cruelty disguised as love. Most importantly, he'd learned that justice and revenge weren't the same thing, but sometimes they looked identical from the outside. Standing in his new apartment, bigger, brighter, in a better neighborhood, Daniel had looked at the photo of his actual family on the mantel. Sarah was there, along with Claire and his parents, all of them smiling at a barbecue the weekend before. These were the people who deserved his trust, his loyalty, his love. These were the people who had earned their place in his life through their actions, not their words. The baby that wasn't his was probably walking by now, taking her first steps in Eric's parents' basement. Daniel hoped she would grow up to be better than her parents. He hoped she would learn to value honesty and loyalty, and the kind of love that didn't come with conditions or deceptions. But that wasn't his responsibility anymore. His responsibility was to the family he'd chosen and who had chosen him in return. Daniel had poured himself a glass of whiskey, the good stuff, not the cheap bottle he'd been able to afford when he was married to Melissa, and had raised it in a silent toast to the future. Justice had been served. The truth had been revealed. The guilty had been punished. And Daniel Ross, the man who'd been too trusting and too stupid, had proven that he was neither of those things. He was simply a man who believed that actions should have consequences, and who had the patience and intelligence to make sure they did.